Hello, and thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Royal Secrets. We're all enjoying this book very much. I think it's a relief with all the bad news out there. I think it's just such a relief to sort of have a jolly romp through a book and not have to think too much and just enjoy the stories. Now, in today's episode, it's quite interesting because we often think about, when we hear about the staff and when we hear about people that are in power above the staff, your sympathies generally go with the staff and hope that they'll be treated well. Well, sometimes the royal family themselves were actually treated quite poorly by the staff. The shoe was on the other foot. And so I'm going to tell you a few of those stories in this episode because we're up to that in the book. Now, Stephen Barry says that sometimes when the then Prince Charles needed a car and needed a chauffeur to go to a particular engagement, he usually had his set chauffeur, the one that he was used to. But sometimes he was unavailable. He might be away on holiday or he might have been deployed somewhere else. And so if that was the case, a random sort of chauffeur from the Royal Mews would actually be appointed for the job. And there was about 10 that used to rotate, so they wouldn't necessarily have encountered this particular chauffeur before. Well, on this particular occasion, in this particular story, you can see that it didn't go very well. So they were off to Eastbourne in the Rolls, and there were three other people in the car. There was Stephen Barry, there was David Checketts, who was the then Prince Charles's private secretary, and there was Paul Officer. And Paul Officer was a detective or police protection officer, and he was actually quite high up in the police force. He was the superintendent. But isn't that a gorgeous name for an actual policeman? Paul Officer, it's just perfect. Anyway, they head off to Eastbourne in the Rolls. All goes well with this new chauffeur that they've never met before. But it was on the way back to Windsor where they actually suffered a bit of a fright. But this guy seemed to be a little out of control, and Stephen Barry actually describes it like this. I don't know whether the chauffeur had it in mind to cut down the time driving back or if he'd had a few drinks while he was waiting, but he drove like a lunatic. Paul Officer, as a police superintendent, more or less commanded him to slow down, but he didn't. And so they were going over railway crossings and everything, and they were getting airborne because he was taking everything so fast. It was just ridiculous, taking corners so fast. And the then Prince Charles and David Checketts were in the back. Stephen Barry was in the front, and the police detective was in the back. So there's three in the back, and they were getting tossed around to such a degree that Stephen Barry said that they were black and blue by the time they got back to Windsor, and he had never seen Prince Charles so angry. So the next day, Prince Charles rings up Sir John Miller, who's in charge of all this, and says he never wants that chauffeur to drive him again. And I don't blame him, do you? I mean, that's so dangerous. He would have felt so vulnerable. And I guess it would have crossed his mind too, is this some sort of assassination attempt? Is this some sort of set-up thing where, I'm meant to die in the car? Like, it would cross your mind, particularly in this era, because the royal family was constantly under threat in the late 70s, early 80s. But the man wasn't fired. He was just demoted, and they never saw him again, which is good. But isn't it amazing that he didn't actually get fired? Now, Paul Officer, the police protection officer I told you about, who's also happened to be a superintendent, actually saved the life of the then Prince Charles twice. Once was in Palm Beach, Florida, after a polo match. Prince Charles actually suffered heat stroke, and Paul Officer got him the help required in time. The second time was when the Prince was in the Navy at Portland Naval Base, and I'll just read you this bit. Now, Paul was in the room next door to the Prince's. They were on shore, in Shore Barracks. Suddenly, he was awakened in the early hours of the morning by a crashing noise coming from the Prince's room. Now, he knew that the Prince should be alone, and so he dashed inside the room, and this is what he saw. He found a fellow naval officer in the room, demented, trying to attack the Prince with a chair. Now, the prince, being in bed and had been sound asleep, was at a disadvantage because this guy was on top of him with a heavy chair. And so he was at a terrible disadvantage. So Paul Officer had to drag the guy off Prince Charles, whereupon Prince Charles did, jump out of bed and helped Paul Officer actually subdue this man and get him under control. But get this, I cannot believe this. When the prince joined his next ship, he was horrified to find that one of his fellow officers was the same man, the same demented man who had attacked him in the shore barracks. And he was understandably rather upset about this. He was upset that he was put in such a potentially dangerous situation, actually having to serve in close quarters with a demented person that had already attacked him once. So he was really angry at the breach of security, and obviously the guy was taken off the ship. But again, you would think that if you attacked a prince with a chair in a demented fashion, that maybe you wouldn't have a role as an officer in the Royal Navy anymore. Stephen Barry goes on to say that the prince's bachelor days were actually really good and really enjoyable. They often used to have sort of boys' weekends away where it'd be Stephen Barry, Checkett's, the private secretary, the detective, and they would go out fishing all day and do sort of boys' things, and they would put out lobster pots on the Isle of Scilly, and they stayed at this beautiful, beautiful tiny house called Tamarisk on the Scilly Isles off the coast of Cornwall. And this used to be run by a Mrs. Hall. And if they managed to actually catch some lobster in their lobster pots, Mrs. Hall was magnificent at cooking lobster. And they would have a lovely beach weekend. And actually, he went on to say that after the prince got married, the Princess Diana absolutely loved staying at this beautiful little house. It was only a little house, just had, a lounge room and a dining room and a few bedrooms, but it was right on the sand, right overlooking the water, and it was just beautiful and cozy and remote, and they would never get disturbed, so they could be very, very private there. And evidently it's still loved by the royal family now, but I do sort of worry that Stephen Barry might have given it a bit away in this book, but hopefully they can still enjoy their time there. Well, this particular evening, Mrs. Hall had cooked the lobster, and unfortunately, Checkett's, the private secretary, now they said that he must have got a bit of crook lobster, but seeing they all ate it, I have a feeling that maybe Checkett's was actually allergic to shellfish. That's what I'm thinking, because he was, very ill. We won't go into detail, but he was in and out of the lounge room. They were actually watching Laurence Olivier starring in a Hamlet and on TV, and poor old Checkett's was going off and being sick, just about every half hour. You know what it's like. My husband's uncle was really allergic to shellfish, and that happened to him at our wedding, because we served shellfish at our wedding, and it happened to him at our wedding. It's just awful, and it's so violent. Anyway, we won't go on about that. But the prince actually fell asleep in front of this Hamlet on the TV, and Stephen Barry said that the rest of them were sitting there really bored, but they were too scared to change the channel because, the prince, and even though he was snoring his head off. And when Prince Charles woke up, he was told that Checkett's was dreadfully ill and had been running in and out, being ill. And he said something which I thought was rather telling. I don't think it reflects very well on the then Prince Charles. I hope he has matured into some form of compassion now. But when the prince woke up, he found the thought of Checkett's throwing up all evening hilariously funny. And then Stephen Barry goes on to say, the royals do, I'm afraid, have a habit of enjoying other people's discomfort. I've noticed that in quite a few books, actually. I guess they have to be tough. I guess, Prince Charles was sent away to really rough sort of boarding schools. He was bullied, he was picked on. And so I guess you sort of get to the point where you do lose a little bit of compassion. I'm sure as he's matured and he's had Camilla to help him, he's got a little bit of it back. I hope so anyway. But he also went to say that David Checkett's used to get furious at the influence that Lord Mountbatten had on the then Prince Charles. And I'll just read you that little bit. He resented the late Lord Mountbatten's influence enormously. He used to get furious when Lord Mountbatten interfered, and Lord Mountbatten interfered a lot. And he goes on to say about Amanda Knatchbull. Now, of course, she was Lord Mountbatten's granddaughter, and we all know that he really wanted the then Prince Charles to actually get engaged to her. Now, many books have claimed that Prince Charles actually did propose to Amanda, and he was actually knocked back. However, Stephen Barry says that's rubbish, that he actually never proposed to Amanda Knatchbull, that they both knew that they weren't attracted to each other, and that was just an invention of some royal biographers, probably leaked to them from Lord Mountbatten. But he goes on to say something really, really interesting. He says that Amanda was a sweet, quiet girl who is now training to be a social worker. But here's the interesting bit. Prince Charles never showed the slightest bit of excitement when she was around. Other girls, particularly Lady Diana, made him sparkle and brought him to life. Now, it's well documented, and I believe it, that initial attraction between Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer was real. They were very passionate. I believe that in the early days of their marriage, they were very amorous, very passionate. I mean, it's documented, even in Wendy Berry's book, The Housekeeper's Diary, that they were quite in love and quite physically attracted to each other, and so that's all good. They did definitely have a honeymoon period that lasted quite a few years, and they were in love. They were. I believe that. David Checketts was against the whole thing. He could see exactly what Lord Mountbatten was up to. This is trying to marry, Prince Charles off to Amanda. He'd married off his nephew, Prince Philip, to the future Queen of England, and now he was trying to marry his granddaughter off to the next king. So we all know that was a plan that, rather failed dismally. But the staff liked Amanda, but they didn't want it to happen. And do you know why? Because with Amanda Knatchbull came the whole Mountbatten family, the Brabournes and the Knatchbulls. And let's just say that they wouldn't just be inheriting a new princess, they would be inheriting 10 Brabournes and the Knatchbull family, and none of Lord Mountbatten's family was exactly backward in coming forward. Most of them were highly ambitious. He says a little bit more about Lord Mountbatten, a man of enormous charm, equally enormous vanity, and the most incredible energy. He nearly wore me out when we went to India with him. That actually made me giggle a bit, because now I've interviewed, Andrew Loney and read the Mountbatten's book, and it's clear that, Lord Mountbatten was bisexual and did have affairs with men. And I'm just wondering just quite how he wore Stephen out in India. Now, of course, the sad IRA attack against Lord Mountbatten, and of course Lord Mountbatten's grandson Nicholas Knatchbull died aged just 14. A young Irish boatman died, and the Dowager Lady Brabourne in her 80s also died. Now Patricia, Lord Mountbatten's daughter, also was dreadfully injured in that attack, and she was actually on a life support machine for weeks and weeks. Now, when she was well again, she told the then Prince Charles of her experience. And I just want to read you this little bit. She could hear, Prince Charles said to me, his voice awed. She could understand every word that was being said, but she couldn't move a muscle to tell anyone that her brain was still working. Now, I think that's everyone's greatest fear, isn't it? To actually be in a coma and paralyzed and be able to move, but be aware enough that your brain is working, that you can actually hear everybody that is talking around you after you wake up from your coma, but you still can't move a muscle to let them know that you understand everything. I think that's probably everyone's greatest fear. And Stephen Barry says that around this time he was terrifically interested in reincarnation and near-death experiences, so he was really sort of delving into Patricia Brabourne's experience. And he was convinced that he was going to be reincarnated next time he came back, but of course he was convinced he was going to be reincarnated as someone really important. I can't imagine that then Prince Charles thought he was going to come back as a dustman or, a footman or a page. No, he thought he was going to come back of someone of great historical significance. Now, here's a juicy tidbit. He also says a little bit about girlfriends and things, as you know. Now, there was a girlfriend pre-marriage to Lady Diana Spencer, so all perfectly above board, but it was Janet Jenkins. And when Stephen Barry was actually in Canada promoting his first book, Royal Service, his phone rang in his hotel room one night in Toronto. It was Janet Jenkins, one of Prince Charles's girlfriends, whom I liked very much and got to know quite well. "Could I have a copy of the book?" she asked me. "I'm told I'm in it." She was. I asked her over to my hotel for a drink and gave her a copy. "Do you know," she said to me that night, "I wrote to Prince Charles when I heard he was marrying Diana, and I asked if he would like back all the letters that I had received from him, and he said no, that I should keep them. Wasn't that marvellous?" Then Stephen Barry goes on to say, "It was marvellous. It confirmed my feeling that the prince has always been brilliant at picking charming, pretty, exciting girls who knew how to keep their mouths shut." After hearing about Janet Jenkins, I think we must read Royal Service, don't you? I think we need to find out more about this lovely lady. Now, he goes on to say in chapter 6 about travelling rather royally, and he tells us all about the Royal Train, which is just fascinating. He says a bit more about the Royal Yacht Britannia. Now, in his first book, Royal Service, he really tells us about Royal Yacht Britannia, so I'll probably save some of that for when we go over that one. But it's so interesting about the Royal Train. It just makes you want to go on it. It just makes you want to be royal just so you could go on that train. Now, he says that the royals themselves are a little on the blasé side about overseas travel. They would rather be at Balmoral. I suppose they get used to it, and I suppose it's quite taxing because they are actually working and being charming, aren't they? But the Duke of Edinburgh was never, ever sick of travel. The staff used to joke that he was suffering from permanent jet lag. Now, he does point out that overseas trips cost the royals nothing. So if an engagement happens to take place at a spot not far from somewhere where they would love to holiday, they all sort of compete for those sort of jobs because they can get their travel costs covered and then they can go off on holiday after that, which is sort of that's what Meghan and Harry did after the Nigeria thing, I think. They also did it after the Jamaica appearance. So when they get their travel expenses sort of, covered, they go on to have a little bit of a further holiday. So Harry's learnt that well from his daddy. But he says that there was always keen competition, and Prince Margaret achieved gold status when it comes to freeloading her way to the Caribbean. Now, of course, she has her place in Mystique, of course. And so she would try to grab all the jobs sort of in that vicinity, and then she would go off to her house on Mystique for a couple of weeks. The Prince of Wales is not above such tactics. If he wants to go to the Bahamas or to play polo in Miami, he'll fix himself a visit to Canada or Venezuela to cut down on fares. Then he goes on to say about Princess Anne's husband, Mark Phillips. In 1983, he was going to Australia to compete in an equestrian event, and Princess Anne wanted to go. And so Princess Anne's private secretary was actually ringing around and even rang sort of, the embassy in Australia and said, "Oh, Princess Anne would be available if you would like her to come to Australia." But Diana and Charles had just done a big tour of Australia, and we had a Labor government in Australia that wasn't particularly, sort of enamoured of the royal family. And they said, "Oh, no, it's fine. No, we're right. No, don't worry. We don't want her to come." So Princess Anne didn't come, but do you know what she did? She organised that interview with Michael Parkinson. Now, Michael Parkinson was in Australia actually filming a whole series of fantastic interviews that were actually aired on the BBC and aired on our ABC, but they were actually filmed in Australia because Michael Parkinson lived in Sydney for about 6 months of the year, and he used to love to play golf in Australia, so he was sort of half Australian. He used to spend half his life here. And so Princess Anne actually arranged to do an interview with Michael Parkinson. Her fares were covered to Australia as a consequence, and her fee from the show she actually donated to the Save the Children Fund. Now, from that interview, which you can actually see on YouTube, and I'm going to link it for you down below in the show notes description for this actual episode, so you can go off and see it. I'm sure many of you have seen it, but it's really worth seeing because she describes the kidnapping attempt against her, and she comes across as so brave. And actually, her husband comes across very well too. They seem to be really still in love at that stage. And the wonderful thing is, from the strength of that interview, people fell in love with Princess Anne from that point. Now, you've got to understand that she wasn't actually that popular. In the early days of Diana and Charles's marriage, and just before that, Anne wasn't that popular. She just sort of rubbed people up the wrong way. She was quite abrupt. She didn't do a lot of engagements. She was sort of seen as a bit of a freeloader who didn't sort of do enough to earn her civil list money. But from the point of that Michael Parkinson interview, the tide turned. People were really in her favour. And for the first time after her kidnapping attempt, she ranked more popular than Princess Diana in that popularity poll of that year. And do you know what? She has stayed popular, as you know, ever since. So that was a real turning point in the public perception of Princess Anne. Now we get on to the royal train, because this is just the best bit. And he talks about the fact that it was refurbished in 1977. Now the new train, because it was all refurbished, had two special day salons, one for the Queen and one for Prince Philip, which the British press noted sardonically as his and her carriages. Now this is the description of the Queen's carriage, and I think it just sounds divine, and it just makes me want to go. It just makes me want to be there. The Queen's own coach has a formal entrance, double doors, lounge, bedroom and bathroom, with a separate bedroom and bathroom for her dresser. So that would have been Bobo McDonald, I guess. The Duke has much the same arrangement, only slightly smaller, and he only has a shower. He doesn't have a bath. Now, when the Duke's not on the train and the Queen's on the train, Prince Charles actually gets the Duke of Edinburgh's suite on the train, and he doesn't like it because he likes his baths and he doesn't like just having a shower. So when all the royals are on the trains, their old royal trains are running, on the same night. If the entire family are going up to Balmoral, Princess Anne and the rest of the family get the really ancient rolling stock and all the out of practice crew. Now, Stephen Barry says that the only time that Prince Charles ate breakfast was actually on the royal train, because all the royal family loved the chefs on the royal train. They just thought that the breakfast was fantastic. And they said, why is it that we can have this beautiful breakfast on the royal train when the galley on the royal train is minute and all the chefs are crammed in and it's rocking around and they don't have any room and the food is superb? And they said in the massive modern kitchens at the castles, often it's not as good. They couldn't work it out. And I guess it could have been that maybe on the royal train, everything was actually delivered still hot. Do you think? Because they had to cover such vast distances in the castles, particularly Windsor, to get to the dining room. I guess everything's a bit sort of cold and tasteless by the time it gets there. And he tells a funny story that they're coming back from Balmoral and they all board the royal train, and the Queen had been saying goodbye to the train master and everything. And Stephen Barry actually has to walk through the Queen's sort of stateroom on the train to get to Prince Charles's, because he was staying in the Duke of Edinburgh's one. And he just went to walk through the sitting room, and he didn't expect the Queen to be there. And there she was on her hands and knees with a headscarf on her head. And she was spreading out copies of the Times and the Financial Times to cover the new beige carpet. "Excuse me, Your Majesty," I said as I edged past her. She looked up and said, "Oh, hello, Stephen." She said, "I'm just putting these down for the dogs." When we were using the train for out-of-London engagements, the Prince always came back to his own carriage for a bath and to change after the work was done. And there I would be sitting on a siding somewhere, surrounded by a ring of security inside the train. The Prince would be happily relaxing in a hot, foamy bath while they're on a siding. We've heard other things that went on the siding on the Royal train, haven't we? Now, I've got to explain that the bath was in an older carriage that Prince Charles used to request. If he wasn't travelling with the Queen, he was quite happy to have the older rolling stock because they used to have the older, more old-fashioned baths. Stephen Barry finishes up about the Royal train by saying, "I love travelling on the Royal train, and even the royals regarded it as a perk. British Rail does the best breakfast in the world, and they also have a superb wine cellar." Now he goes on to talk about helicopters and planes and things like that. And did you know that the Queen is not allowed to travel on helicopter? There's only been a few exceptions. She's also not allowed to travel on a single-engine aircraft. Isn't that amazing? I didn't know that. Now, the two exceptions were when she went to Northern Ireland because they thought it would actually be safer for her to travel around Ireland on a helicopter because they said she could make a quick getaway if she needed to. And also on the 40th anniversary of the D-Day landings, she actually did it in helicopter because they were showing her the D-Day landings from above, and so of course she had to go up into a helicopter. But he tells a near miss that the Duke of Edinburgh had, which is quite chilling, and I'll just read it how he actually explains it. In 1981, Prince Philip, who loves to fly himself, caused the most terrific upset in Britain when an handover of the Queen's flight narrowly missed a Miami-bound British Airways Boeing 747. It was climbing at 300 miles per hour away from Gatwick Airport. Now, it took 3 days before the palace would admit that the near miss was caused by Prince Philip. And how it happened was, he's supposed to be flying in what's called the Purple Corridor, which is reserved for royalty. But he was flying 1,000 feet too low. And he was a mile ahead of the jumbo, but that's only 10 seconds flying time. Now, the pilot of the 747 had to take evasive action to save over 260 passengers that he had on board, and the near miss, 10 seconds. And if the pilot of the 747 hadn't taken evasive action, all of them would have died. Now, it's not really good enough, is it? And they didn't deny that he was at the controls, but they didn't confirm it. Now, the incident happened on a Friday afternoon. No one worked over the weekend, so no one was able to establish, what exactly happened. The pilot of the 747 was saying, "Look, I just saw something black near miss and I took evasive action. Can you please find out what the hell that was?" Considerably upset. Then the palace, over time, early the next week, had to admit it. And he says something rather telling. He says, "I was working at the palace at the time. Nothing was said about the incident, but then nothing was ever said about any royal misdemeanour." And not good enough. I hope they're more transparent now. I remember Prince Charles and I were flying together to Scotland one time in the Andover, and I went to see him in his study and I said, "Sir, do you realise we ought to get going?" And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because, sir, it's 11 and the plane leaves at 12. "Oh, keep calm, Stephen, don't worry," he said. "They won't go without me." Now, I'm going to finish up this episode telling you a little bit about the Royal Yacht Britannia, and it is quite amazing, but you wouldn't believe what it used to cost to run. It used to cost £3 million a year to run, so no wonder it was decommissioned. And there was a staff, now where is that staff number? 277 crew. It's not just staff, is it? It's crew. The Queen takes her own staff when she's on board. All the other royals use the naval crew, who are terribly efficient. It was built in 1953. It was 412 feet long, and he describes the royal apartments, which are in the aft, spread over 3 decks. The top deck contains the royal bedrooms and bathrooms, of which there are 4. All have large single beds. And the main deck supports a drawing room which can hold 200 people. It even has a fireplace. There's a deck with a dining room which seats up to 60 people, and that doubles as a cinema. But the favourite part that they used to love to have their breakfast on the veranda deck, which was outside, and it used to get all the sun. And he said that that veranda deck was really popular with Prince Charles and Princess Diana on their honeymoon. They used to love to have their breakfast and lunch out on the veranda deck, and Princess Diana used to sunbake out there. But there was an enormous amount of cabins for the staff. There was 20 household cabins just for the royal family staff. Then there was 40 cabins for other staff. And he said a really interesting thing. He said that in the refurbishment that there was a strike of workers and a lot of the panelling in the staff quarters were missing and it never got fixed. It never got finished. So the 40 cabins of the sort of lower staff, a lot of them were missing walls and things like that. Now, the Britannia has a garage on board in case the Queen wished to take her own Rolls Royce with her. Now, of course, Stephen Barry actually, I put that in past tense, but Stephen Barry in this book is talking in present tense because at the time of this book being written, Britannia was still sailing the seas, of course. The Duke uses Britannia at Cowes as a floating home for his yearly sailing regatta week there, and the Prince and Princess Diana use it as their honeymoon. Now, the Queen, it's her floating palace. And she would, impress people on her official tour to California in 1983. Of course, Ronald Reagan was entertained on board. Now, this is what the royal family travel with. They don't take piles of luggage, but they do arrive with, listen to this list, records, record player, fishing rods, shotguns, videotapes, photos, books, chocolates, their favourite trinkets, anything they can to make it look homey. They even move the film projector between Balmoral and Sandringham on board, and the pipe major doubles as a projectionist. There's a really moving thing about the then Prince Charles. He treasured a casual snapshot of Lady Diana and he always kept it beside his bed, and everywhere he went he used to take it with him in his luggage. And also he had another favourite photograph of her which he kept at Highgrove, and he had it framed because he just loved it so much, and it was taken on their royal honeymoon, and she's laughing in it really naturally and she's wearing a skimpy green bikini, and Stephen Barry said that the Prince just adored it and, really treasured that, which I think is quite lovely, isn't it? He goes on, I'll finish up with the presents that the royals receive, and he says a really funny story about Imelda Marcos, the wife of the Philippines president. Do you remember back in the 80s, Imelda Marcos used to be famous for all her shoes? She used to have this inordinate sort of shoe collection, and no one could believe how many shoes she had. Well, she also used to be very generous and used to gift the royal family, and she had a bit of a soft spot for the then Prince Charles. And when they were at Windsor one day, they got word that a present had arrived from Madame Marcos. When they went out to the stables to have a look, it was a speedboat. But the only thing is, this beautiful sort of hand-finished wooden speedboat, it sounds like it's, like a vintage one, didn't have any engines. And when they looked in to see how much the engines would have cost, it would have been £36,000. So the prince didn't want to spend that, so he donated the boat to a youth organisation, and the Queen's Jubilee Appeal paid for the engines for them. So he's very practical. They used to get gifts of jewellery, and often the prince wanted to hock it off, jewellery he received for a new polo pony or to pay a groom for his polo pony, but he didn't often get away with that. He would get the no. He would get the no, actually, you can't do that. And a lot of the staff used to get great trinkets and tips, and they loved going to any Arab country because, they would get a lot of generous, very generous tips, diamonds and gold and all sorts of things. And they used to love it when the duty-free or customs officers were out on strike because all the staff would smuggle their loot when they got on shore. And Stephen Barry finishes this chapter by saying about his clothing, how he had to be really well kitted out. But he was saying that the royal family were really tight. When it came to their personal expenditure, they were so careful with money. They were very Scottish. And the prince did pay me a clothing allowance. Obviously, I always had to look reasonably well dressed, as I was just 2 paces behind him most of the time. But I'm afraid the allowance didn't cover my dress expenses completely. The royal family, I fear, is tight as a Scotsman's purse, so I've never really bothered to explain that I'm out of pocket for my outfits. It wouldn't have made any difference. And I'll be back with another chapter on Monday. Yes, on Monday. So look out for that one. It will be chapter 7, and it's A Pride of Princesses. And that's really interesting, actually, because it tells all about Princess Michael of Kent, and it has a few juicy tidbits about the very bad behaviour of Princess Margaret at Balmoral. Make sure you're subscribed, and can you help out by actually sharing this video? If you have any friends that you think would really enjoy this book and enjoy these fun stories, can you share it with them? I'd really appreciate it. Okay, I'll see you again really soon. Bye.